talk a little bit about how to update your applications with Managed SQL Connections. Oops, I went too far. John mentioned this morning what you would have to do to upgrade your application. So you would migrate to 19.0, add the C connection object to your application object. He showed you those 3 or 4 lines of code that you had to add. Create a managed connection. You saw him do that. That extra step in there is what I'm going to talk about, and then go. And that's pretty much it. That's what you do. If you don't already use SQL, you migrate to 19.0, you add a connection object to your application object, you create the managed connection, you convert to SQL, and you compile and run. And that's what you do. Thank you. Okay. It really kind of is that easy. I'm not trying to downplay it. Of course, things can get a little bit interesting depending upon what you've done. You know, you're not sitting out there going, gee, how can I upgrade and convert order entry mobile and deploy that? You've got a few more things going on in your application. So I've tried to make it a little bit more interesting, but we'll see what happens. So let's go to here. And the first thing I'm going to do is I've got 18.2, because it was handy. And I've got the web order mobile application. Now this was already converted to SQL. So this is running on SQL Server, and I have right here, like if I go and open up the customer file, you can tell that it's running on SQL Server because it's got the native types in there. And I can also right-click and say, open up the INT file. And you can see, as John talked about this morning, we've got our connection in there, and there's that whole, in every INT file, the entire connection string is right in the top of the INT file. So you can see that this is on the server SQL Express. It's a trusted connection, thank God. Otherwise, my username and password would be right there as well. It's the database order entry 182. And then this is what the rest of the table is defined as. And so all the different tables have that information in it. I also thought about, well, you know, not everybody is just every table in one server, one database. So, and as John showed earlier, you can have multiple databases involved. So I kind of cheated, and into my order entry application, I brought in album. One of the, John did it this morning, so I can do it too. Not the only one that knows how to do this stuff. And so in the album, what I've got is I've got the same server, it's a trusted connection, but it's a different database. Because as you move over into trusted connections, if you have multiple databases or multiple servers going on, you're going to need to know how to create a connection for one and a connection for the others. So this is just one little tiny way of trying to simulate a little bit more real-world example of trying to bring an application that is already talking to multiple databases into trusted connections. And I can just, to show you that it actually runs, this is the 18.2 version. And there's my application. I've got my customers and my orders and my line items. And if I go back, just to show you that I just didn't bring the album table over, I actually jammed in a select view real quick. It actually is really an album view in there, and I can look at the albums from the other database. So here's an application that has a little bit more complexity to it. The other thing that we'll look at real quick is, what does this all look like? All right, so I've got my 18.2 web application. This is the web application here. It's web order mobile. It's the standard one. It's just been converted to SQL. And if I go and look at IIS, I can see on my default website there, I've got the web order mobile 18.2. All right, so we can see that I've got a web app set up. It's running. It's got connected to a database. It's using all the INT files the old way. Everything's all there. So how do we bring this into 19.0? It's actually pretty darn easy. So I'm going to go into 19.0. Here's the 19.0 studio. I'm going to open a workspace. I'm going to go find that example, which is web order mobile. And it's going to say, wait a minute, this is an older workspace. Let's migrate this. So I say, yep, that's the one I want. Instead of keeping it web order mobile, I'm going to call this web order managed, except I have two A's in there, managed. So it's copying the workspace over. I finish. First thing it is it's a web app, and it says, wait a minute, this is an old web app. You need the new JavaScript engine. Would you like me to copy that in now? I don't know why we ever say no, but it's not a really smart thing to do. So let's just say yes. And it's going to take a moment to copy that in. Almost there. And bingo. All right. So now I have my workspace migrated. And so let's look at a few things going on here. First of all, here's all my tables. And if I look at these tables, I can see that they're still connected the old way, which makes sense. I haven't done anything to bring them over into the managed connections yet. But it's all there and it's all working, so I can look at album. I can see that he's connected to a certain server, a database. I can look at customer and see that it's in the other database. So everything's all there. That's all good. If I wanted to try and run this right now, what would be wrong? Anybody got any idea of what would happen if I tried to run this? It's a web app. It's a web app that's still pointing right there. The old web app's still there. If I ran this, it would actually run just fine. It wouldn't be the 19.0 version because the directory is still pointing to a perfectly good web app running under 18.2. So that's kind of like tip number one, don't be fooled. So, and the other thing I want to do is there's two pieces when you look at a web application that you want to make sure that you don't trip over. When you've got lots of different revisions installed and you've got lots of different, and you're bringing web apps through all those different revisions, be careful about the web application name and then be careful about the virtual directory. You want to make sure that you don't use the same web application name that already exists where you're living, which I know I do. I have a web app mobile in 19.0, and I don't want to mess with that. And then I also want to make sure that I'm creating a new virtual directory for this version of this application. So you can call these anything you want. I just like to do this because it reminds me what I'm doing. So I'm going to do managed, and that's going to set me up right. I'm going to have a nice new clean web app name that isn't going to interfere with anything that's already in 19.0. And I'm going to have a nice new clean virtual directory that isn't going to interfere with anything anywhere. Now remember, one of the things I told you this morning about 19.0 is you're not just limited to the default website. So let's not publish this to the default website. Let's publish this to the Synergy website. And the Synergy website we'll look at in a second. I'll say we'll do that. So now I should be able to compile this and run it. And there we are. And you can see it's using the proper virtual directory. So now I have my application. It's in 19.0. I've made sure that I can run the web app. It's all still there. The connections are still to both of my different databases. So now we can start doing some more 19.0-ish stuff to it. So I've got it all there. And then the next thing I wanted to show you is, and Harm mentioned this, when I migrated my application, remember this was an 18.2 application where we didn't have server-side web properties. And so the migration looked at the file list and said, my gosh, you don't have the web app properties table that you need. So it actually put it in there for me. And an interesting thing about this is, if you look at the connection, anybody have any clue as to what kind of table this is going to be? It's going to be an embedded table. It's using the Dataflex driver. Because it didn't know where I wanted to put it. It wasn't going to be so presumptuous as to say, oh, I'll stick it over here. So it just created the nice embedded table, and it's there. And if you look at it, you can see that this is something else that Harm mentioned. It's got a data. That's where the actual data that gets passed back and forth, or that doesn't get passed back and forth, is there. And you can see it, because it's an embedded table, it can only be a certain size. So we'll kind of check back in on that later. So I've got my web app server prop table. Everything's there. So I could actually start using server properties right now. If I knew enough to be able to have a server property in this application, a web property in this application, and change it, even without using managed connections, even without doing anything else, I could start using server properties in this application, and it would work just fine. So when you look at bringing stuff in, it's not just to get managed connections, it's to get all the capabilities that are in 19.0. You just got to kind of decide which ones you want to bring in first. So we've got that, and I wanted to show you real quick, if we look at IIS, there's my default website, there's my Synergy website. You can see that I now have this application under a different website. And if I look at the application pool for Synergy and look at the advanced settings, I do not have 32-bit applications enabled here. So again, you don't have to worry about that stuff anymore. All right, so we've got that. We've got the server prop files. So let's go and look at our application. And we said that one of the things we're going to have to do is we're going to have to put our connection object inside our application object. So let's do that. Object, O, connection is a C connection. And I need to use login encryption.pkg. That's it. So let's compile that and run it. And the app runs just fine. Because remember we said, oops, well, if you type, it runs just fine. So remember we said, as you're bringing this stuff over, even though I'm not using managed connections yet, it's not going to get in the way. So I have my code in there. I'm set to use managed connections, but I haven't quite decided whether I can do it yet. So everything's there. It's all good. And I think the next thing I want to do is I actually want to make a connection. So let's do that. Let's go in and say Database, SQL Connection Manager. I'm going to add a connection here. And I'll call this SWM. And I will use Windows Authentication. And SQL Express. Test my connection. That's all good. I'm going to do my order entry 182. I've got it there. I can test it. I save it. I now have a managed connection. So now I've got all those tables that have all those INT files. And yeah, I only have a few, but you can think of this as, okay, it's the 382 tables that you have in your application. You're going to do the same thing. You're going to go and you're going to say, what do I do to get these guys in there? Actually, you know what I'm going to do first? I have that one embedded table that I want to make sure that I convert over to SQL, but I didn't want to convert it the old way. Let's convert that one using this new managed connection that I just set up. So I go to Database, Conversion, and I see Convert using managed connections. There I've got my connection that I just set up. And I only want this guy, the web app server property. I do want to convert it to a standard table. I don't need to give it an owner because it's DBO is going to be the default there. I know what I did. Because this is what happens when you don't pay attention and you already converted it earlier when you were practicing. So, let's get rid of it and try it again. See? Always do a hard reset. Mm-hmm. Try it there. Try it there. Convert to standard. Much gooder. So now I have my server props. It is now using my server database, and it's using the Managed Connection ID SWM. And a nifty little thing that it did along the way, Harm, you weren't quite sure about this, it said, oh, wait a minute, you're going to be in the SQL world now. I'll change your data type of that to varchar max, and now you can store much larger hunks of data, and you don't have to do. One of the things, I don't know if Harm really went into this or not, but because we don't know how big a chunk of data you might be dealing with for your server property, it might be too big to fit in that field when it was just the embedded database and it was only a certain size. So we would actually cut it up into pieces and page it together. So now it doesn't necessarily need to do that unless you exceed, what's the, is it, how big is it on varchar max? 10 meg or something like that? Anyway, it's pretty big. So now that's already converted. That's all good. So now, how do I get my other tables in? Here's the key. You go to the Connect Repair Wizard. You say, using Managed Connections, using SWM, you say, repair existing. And that allows you to select all of those tables, except I don't want, what do I don't want? 92. Oh, album isn't in there. Oh, that's right, it's in a different database. I'm not connected to it yet. All right, so I was trying to pay attention, make sure I didn't do anything nasty there. So I go there, it says 12 objects, it says OK. And now, if you look at the files, it's now using the ID SWM, it's connected to the right place. If I open up the INT file, it went in and it replaced my big long string with the connection ID. That's what you do. Now, some other things happen on the way to the forum here, so things you want to be aware of. These are very simple INT files. You might have more complex INT files. The process of basically repairing, which is what we do during a repair, is we say, wait a minute, you're already an SQL Server table. If there's an INT file there, I'm going to try and use as much of it as I know how to in creating a new one. Okay, so it really actually married what the old INT file was, which had that big long connection string in it, with what it knew it wanted to do with the new INT file, which was put in the Managed Connection ID. And you may find that you might have things in your old INT file that we weren't smart enough yet to marry well together. So it's entirely possible that you could lose some settings. So if you have, back up your INT files, number one, and then do a compare and see what was lost and why. And then tell us soon. because the more you can tell us about things that we aren't necessarily married right, the faster we're going to be able to try and get them into the logic of the marriage, because our intent is to make this so that we lose as little as possible. As a matter of fact, the overall intent is we should only lose what isn't really accurate anymore. As some of you have found out during the beta process, some of you had things that were in your INT file that were no longer in the database. And it never used to complain before, and now it will, unless you rebuild them and make it go away. All right, so that's one of the things that repair will do. It will help you find INT and database mismatches of things that can't exist because we no longer like those things in our INT files, so that we can rebuild them correctly when the time comes. All right, so we're trying to get rid of all the old stuff and kind of clean out the floss. So now I've got all these things there. Let's see what happens if I compile. And run. Whoopsie. Bingo. So now I've got my application using Managed Connections. Let's see. What else do we need to do here? One of the things that we talked about is, let's do another connection here. And let's put in our connection for, and we'll call this, what we call this, we'll call this George. And we'll say he's going to go to the John Toohey database. Test it. That's good. So I've got him in there. Oops, don't want to do that yet. Save it. And so now I can go in and say connection. George, repair existing, tables, album. And now I've got my album, and he's using George. And so this is what I would have done with my second set of data. So if you had one of those more complex applications where you're getting some data out of one, some data out of, like you guys try to do this all the time. This is what you would do. You would convert one set, you would convert the other using two different IDs. Both of those IDs are active at the same time because it's a simultaneous connection rather than an alternate connection. You know, John talked about that. You can have multiple connections. It doesn't need to be just two. It can be as many as you need for what you're doing. Just think about it as for any instance of running the application, how many places do I need to connect to be whole, to be complete, to run that instance, all right? As opposed to, okay, I'm running, but now instead of using Peter's data, I want to go and use John's data. I'm going to be user John. So then I'm going to need alternate connections. So, and then think about, like in your case, you'd only need one alternate connection because that one stays constant in your app. You have that second set of data that no matter which subset you're in for the main data, it stays constant. So you're going to be switching this one using alternate connections, and this one's going to stay constant. So let's talk about an alternate connection. Let's go in here and say we're going to add a connection. And this time, we're going to do kind of what John did, where we're going to set up an alternate connection using a different kind of, it's not going to be a different database, it's not going to be a different server, it's going to be a different type of connection where I'm going to use a user login as opposed to a trusted connection. So I want to do SWM, because remember, you use the same ID when it's going to be an alternate connection. So I had SWM first, I created George for that secondary connection, now I'm going to create a second SWM and be able to switch him back and forth. And instead of using Windows authentication, I'm going to use this SWM ID. And by the way, just so that you can see, ahead of time, I went in and I created a login of SWM, and he's got access to a bunch of different databases. And this is something that your DBA is going to do. They're going to, if you're user-based instead of trusted connection-based, they're going to have a bunch of users set up, and they're going to make sure that they have the rights to the appropriate databases. So I've already got him in there, so he should be all good. And I come back, and I say, test my connection, login was successful. It's the same database, order entry 182. Oops, I keep forgetting to uncheck that, because when you have alternate connections, only one can be enabled at a time. So it's just the way it is. So now let's make sure that I test my old one. Here's SWM, I test him. That's using trusted connections. There's with my login, that's good. So let's actually enable him, and you can see that it disabled the other one automatically. Save it, and then open the application URL. What happened? That app's running with an encrypted password that it doesn't know yet. Remember what John talked about? He said, you need a little application to go in and set the encrypted password in the INI file so that it can get in there. Well, I didn't do that. And since this is a web app, now, had this been a Windows application, can anybody tell me what would have happened right now? It would have popped up that login dialog. I would have said, here's my password, boom, and everything would have been lovely, which is kind of what I need to happen now. But I'm running a web app, so how do I do this? What pain am I going to have to go through to fix this? Yeah, can somebody help me with this? All right, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to projects. I'm going to create a new project. I'm going to create a Windows project. I'm going to call it login. I'm going to compile and run it, and I'm going to log in. I'm going to go back to my web app. I'm going to open up my URL, and I'm going to run my application. And I'm still going to type the password wrong. So we're not done yet, though, because we're here in 19.0, and we've got all these wonderful managed connections, and we've figured out how to do trusted logins and user logins, and all the passwords are set, and life is good. People also ask me, it's like, okay, well, what about this, password stuff? What are you doing there? And let's go back to this. You can do whatever you want with your passwords. Someone asked me about this, and so if you look at this login encryption, this is what it does. It basically generates this random key, puts it in loginencryption.inc. So if you want to see what the one is for this application, that's what it came out to be. So that's your seed value. And then you go back to this, and this is our particular instance of this. If you have your own encryption that you want to do, then instead of using cloginencryption.pkg, you can use, C my Torben's special login encryption.pkg. And then whatever it's going to do, if it's going to store keys in a text file, if it's going to go and look them up in a user database, whatever it's going to do is whatever it's going to do. You have full control. All you want it to do is bring it back and say, yeah, now I know how to encrypt, so I can put it in the INI file. And I think how am I, where are we at time-wise? A couple minutes over? All right. There are more things we could do. We could start adding, some indexes, but I'm going to talk about that later. But essentially, that's what you do. You do that kind of stuff, and it just works. And if you were doing the same thing with an application that wasn't in SQL yet, you would have just had a different starting point. You would have brought the app over from whatever revision you were coming from, and then you would have run the conversion wizard, just like I did for just the one table. You would have converted all your tables. Or maybe converted some of them to one connection because you wanted them in one database, and some of them to another one because you wanted them somewhere else. And then you just compile and run. And if it's a web app and that's all you got, make sure you go through the onerous process of creating that little shell and logging in one time. And that's it. Thank you. I think we're taking a break now.